Hey, this is part one of the look into Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. I'm just going to start from book one and talk about the things as they happen, all the events, and try to look into what Thucydides chooses to highlight, why he chooses to highlight certain things, and kind of skim over other major events. And how that develops with his major argument of the war. He's quoted in saying, let me pull it up. So in the beginning of the book, he talks about, I guess, his real reason for the war, and he talks about things in the context of the human condition and why people have this kind of hell-bent nature within them to pursue destruction. And so he talks about the difficulty that this chronicle entailed. He talks about how, he himself was a Athenian general during the time. And he started this chronicle close to the onset of the war, kind of foreseeing that it would be a really pivotal event, not just for the immediate history that he found himself in, but also in world history in its entirety. And so he felt this really strong conviction to kind of, I guess, share his prophetic message of how war works and how people work in light of tragedy. One thing that he said was, those who will want to have a clear understanding of what happened, and such is the human condition, will happen again at some time. So again, that's that prophetic statement. A lot of people have drawn that in relation to World War I and other various events and wars. Because a pivotal point for him is that during this time, it was the height of the Spartan polis up to this point. It's also the height of the Athenian Empire. It's kind of when the war breaks out, it's at the height of both powers. Athens as a naval empire and Sparta as a military genius and unstoppable force. So he doesn't go in chronological order with the events. He does in pieces, but essentially when he starts, he talks about old Greece, the ancient Greece to him, which was before Troy. And before then, he talks about how the Greek peoples are a tribal people. They're a people who tend to just band together in their immediate surroundings and with their immediate tribes. Are an introspective people. And they actually, a lot of these major cities like Sparta and Athens, very few of them are right on the coast, at least some of the older powers. And part of that, he says, is because of a fear of piracy. So there's this kind of chaotic stage that he's setting up. And then the Trojan Wars were really pivotal in large part because it's kind of one of the first major encounters where you see the Greek peoples coming together for a unified goal under a single ruler with Agamemnon. So that really unites them and opens up kind of this international relevance for the Greek peoples, and they have already been banded together, but there's kind of more interaction, and they grow in power as such. So one thing that he starts to talk about is the First Peloponnesian War. So the book spends the majority of the time talking about what we think of as the Peloponnesian War, which is actually kind of the second major conflict. The first one was before the 30 Years' Peace. It wasn't as long or near as devastating, but it certainly led to the events that caused the second major conflict. And he talks about that actually after he talks about the immediate onsets of the second phase of the war, the major phase of the Peloponnesian War. He talks about Corcyra and Pontidia, and then he talks about the First Peloponnesian War. But for this, I'm just going to start by looking at the First Peloponnesian War and kind of talking about from the Spartan Wars how Athens' rise creates a fear in Sparta. That's Thucydides. One of his major points is that fear is actually what drives men to war more than power or prestige or greed. And so starting with that, immediately after the Persian Wars are on the tail end, he starts looking at it. He does mention Thermopylae, and he mentions some other major battles. But essentially where Athens has found themselves is Athens has been sacked by the Persians. They actually abandoned it and fled to their ships. And so they were already a pretty powerful navy, and they had beaten the Persians, or led the Greeks against the Persians in a major victory for the Greeks. And then the Spartans kind of elsewhere were leading more of the field conflicts and defeating the Persians in those. And so, but on their way out, the Persians have, they've been incorporated with certain islands in the Aegean. Obviously, they have to come that way from their empire. And the Athenians are really kind of heading up the process of kicking them out and establishing their own power on their own. And so they launch primarily from what's called the Hellespont, which is north of where the Battle of Thermopylae was, and it's a great staging area to really get into the heart of the Aegean Sea, certainly in the northern part of it. The Spartans are united under their leader Pausias, and so he's a really major Spartan figure. So he's kind of like what Themistocles is for the Athenians. He's that figure for the Spartans. He's one of the two kings, and he is leading the Greek peoples unified against the Persians. However, as they're pushing the Spartans out of the Aegean and further out of the far reaches of Greece, the way it's set up is, and the way Spartans have advertised themselves as being the liberators of Greece. However, Pausias kind of takes command on his own, and he becomes too arrogant, and he imposes his own individual rule and the rule of Sparta over the others, or at least starts to, and there are complaints, and the Spartan council calls him back, and in the void of power, the Athenians really start to assert themselves as, in a way, the new rulers of Greece. So as they're pushing the Persians out, they're making a lot more alliances in the Aegean, expanding their empire, not necessarily by conquest initially, but by these alliances, and forming this Delian League to deal with the Persians. And then at the same time, the Athenians want to rebuild their walls after Athens has been sacked. And essentially, the Spartans don't like this for one of two reasons. The way they say they don't like it is they're like, well, we push back the Persians. If the Persians come back, if they take over Athens, they could use that as a fort if you wall it up. If you don't wall it up, it'll be vulnerable whether they have it or not. So they kind of pose it as this maybe a prudent decision in the chance that Persians come again. However, the Athenians don't buy this. They want to do it for their own protection so that they're not left vulnerable. And the Spartans want them to be left vulnerable because they're seeing how they're growing in power. And up until this point, it really has been the Spartans, and then there's kind of this pretty big gap between them and all the other powers in Greece. There are other powerful states for sure, and certainly they are vested in naval conflicts by the likes of Corinth and Athens, but in terms of field hoplite battles, there's nobody who really comes close to threatening them. but they see Athens gaining wealth and influence, and they fear that. And so if the walls are not there, they could easily march into Attica whenever they will and destroy Athens if they need to be put in their place. So obviously they don't like it, and they've kind of formed this anti-Persian pretense to prevent them from building the walls. However, the Athenian general Themistocles knows that Athens needs a strong port, and since they're not immediately on the coast, their port of Piraeus is a really important piece to their empire. And so he goes to Sparta as a delaying mission. He wants the Athenians to build, and he wants them to build quickly, but he knows he needs to stall the Spartan embassies and to be able to pull this off. So what he does is he tells the Athenians behind him, hey, when I go to Sparta, y'all need to continue to build this wall and use any means necessary. They didn't really have the time to methodically build this wall, so they just kind of scattered in some of the destroyed homes, and they destroyed some homes and took rubble and just kind of threw it together. Thucydides talks about how there was a lot of different materials in the wall, so it's kind of this conglomeration of stones and bricks and tile to be able to form this kind of adjunct wall. Still a wall, but not what it will soon become. And so Themistocles is holding them off. He's trying to negotiate with the Spartans. And he actually agrees and is like, yeah, okay, we won't, I don't know, I guess he's very accommodating. But he also takes his time in Sparta, and then the Spartans send two emissaries to Athens to tell them, we order you to not build this wall. Well, Themistocles knows that once the embassies get there, the ambassadors get there, they'll see the wall being built, and they'll tell the Spartans. But it's still not done, so he's like, all right, well, whenever they get there, you need to stall them, because they will have the news that the wall is being built. But because of the slow travel of communication, they're able to stall the Spartan ambassadors enough to where they build the wall, and then by the time the ambassadors go back to Sparta, Themistocles has already left, and they tell them that the Athenians have built the wall. And of course this pisses Sparta off, and makes Athens more of a threat, and they continue to progress in building their walls. And the idea was eventually to make them so thick that you could actually drive a horse and chariot up and down, so that commerce and supplies from their port could get to the main part of the city in an efficient and protected way. So this is a big win for Athens in order to ensure the security of their empire. While they are in, let's back up a little bit. So while they are in the Aegean, and this is still when Pausaeus is the Spartan leader under the commanding the Greeks, they are taking over control of Cyrus, and they're taking control, the Greeks are, of Byzantium. And then this is when he's replaced for his tyrannical behavior. And so, but then what the Athenians do, and this becomes a really important area in the map that I have in the back of the book that I'm using, it's Caldice, in which I know it's not Italian, so I'm sure I am mispronouncing it, but I'm just going to refer to this region of Greece. It's north, it's immediately south of Macedonia, and I'm just going to refer to it as the Three Fingers because of the three peninsulas. So near this area, by the Three Fingers, is a city called Ion, which at this time is still in Persian hands, but under the command of Cimon, who's a Athenian naval commander. They're able to take control of this and use it as a base to attack kind of this northern area of the Aegean. At the same time, though, they set about the islands of Skyros, which is an adjacent island in the area, and the Athenians take it over and they enslave those people. And so they're making more alliances, but you can kind of imagine they are utilizing this time to for any islands that aren't allied to them or helping them with the Persian, the Persian removal. They are certainly open to removing them, and certainly if it's controlled by the Persians, they're open to removing them and then establishing their domination over those peoples in that area. So they do that at Skyros, and then they also attack another area called Charistus, which is an independent part of a large island called Euboea, which is a large, thin island north of the region of Attica. So it's a really important staging part area where the Athenians can help control the Aegean to the north. Naxos, I guess they get a little nervous and they start to see kind of how it's quickly switching from the Spartans being tyrannical and then getting kicked out, and then the Athenians take over, and then they start kind of acting tyrannical, and shortly the allies start to become subordinate members of the Delian League to the Athenians. And so Naxos is a former ally, but they revolt. But this is put down. However, this is the first time revolt happens under the Athenian Empire, and it happened with the Naxos island refusing to pay tribute and contributing to these military campaigns. Cimon continues to win land and sea battles against the Persians and then the Phocians, which they help supply the Persians with their navy. And they defeat the fleets in the army at Pamphyllia. And so again, these are big battles and big victories for the Athenians and help establish their power. So close to where the Three Fingers are, another island called Thasos rebels over market disputes. And so the Athenians are able to put them down. And at the same time, they send colonists to this area that's called the Nine Ways, which is a city in this Thracian area by the Three Fingers. And the colonists establish themselves, and then they move forward into Thrace, and but they are defeated as the Thracians see this as an aggressive move, and they do not. The Athenian settlers are not able to establish further colonies in that region. However, before Thasos was conquered by the Athenians, they actually appealed to Sparta to invade Attica to stop kind of the Athenian aggression. And so Spartan actually agrees, and this is kind of an under-table deal. But at the very same time, Sparta is wanting to establish war against the Athenians. Again, it goes back to that idea of their fear of Athens. There's really Athens isn't being outwardly aggressive towards Sparta, but they certainly are threatening the Spartan dominance over the Greek world. And so they, if they can attack Athens now before they're super established or what they end up becoming, maybe they can preemptively defeat them before they become a major power. However, this doesn't work. They don't invade Attica because there is an earthquake that hits Sparta. And the way the Spartan rule works is they're able to be such a dominant military because the Spartan citizens are able to train for years and years, and they're not burdened by the agricultural demands of the Greek region. And so what ends up happening is the Helots are those slaves that have to do all the dirty work for the Spartans and allow their society to work the way it does. But when this earthquake happens, the Helots see it as a perfect opportunity to rebel. And they have tried to rebel, and they greatly outnumber the Spartans. And part of the reason the Spartans have tried to set themselves up as such a dominant military power is they almost have to be that way if they're going to subdue the Helots, because, again, they do outnumber the Helots do outnumber the Spartans by a substantial figure. So with the Helot rebellion, the Helots set themselves up in a mountain city of Ithome, and they hold out against the Spartans, and they actually hold out for 3 years. And eventually the siege is frustrating for the Spartans, so they actually call for their allies, including Athens, which is kind of funny because, of course, 3 years prior to this, they were thinking about invading Attica. But, of course, they need the Athenians now, and so they asked them to come. And part of that was because apparently the Athenians had a reputation for being great at developing siege engines and being ingenuitive, or whatever the word would be in those kinds of situations. However, they see this brilliance of the Athenians, or at least how the Athenians are asserting themselves. It's less of a, oh yes, we will humbly come and help you all. I think the way the Spartans saw it was the Athenians are coming and they're kind of tooting their own horn, so much so that they actually were afraid that the Athenians may go around the Spartans and ally themselves with the Helots to try to defeat them. I don't know if this was a legitimate concern or if it was based on anything. It could just be this irrational fear. But again, the Athenians are seen as a threat, and so Spartan leadership deems that they ought to leave. And so the Athenians leave, and they go back to Attica, much to their embarrassment and outrage. None of the other allies have to leave. It's only the Athenians. So that's kind of this first tick between the two after the Persian Wars, that they kind of go at each other. So after 10 years, the Helots are eventually defeated. So it takes a long time, but Sparta does overcome. And they say that these Helots cannot be in the Peloponnese at all, the region of Greece that's really only connected to the mainland of Greece by the small isthmus where Corinth is. They're exiled from that whole area. And so they leave, and Athens sees this as an opportunity to make a good alliance with an enemy of Sparta, and to establish a new city, or new influence over a city. And so they actually give these Helots the city of Naupactus, which is just north of the Peloponnese. It's right near the coast, so it's a perfect kind of security point for the Athenians to establish themselves in. That way, if anything does happen, they have a good coastal area to launch attacks onto the Peloponnese, and not have to go through the isthmus around Corinth. So this is kind of one of the first ticks to set off the First Peloponnesian War and then the Major Peloponnesian War. But there's no direct open conflict between Athens and Sparta at this time. And then there's the Megarian crisis, which Megara is a city on the isthmus that attaches Attica to the Peloponnese. It's on the eastern side, which makes it closer to Athens. But they're at war with Corinth, and apparently this is something that historically has been fairly common, and it's over land disputes in the region, which of course is a very vital region for the Greek war, because that tiny isthmus, a relatively small isthmus, connects the two major powers and two major influential areas in the country. And so Megara is an ally with Sparta, just like Corinth is, but they can't call for Spartan help, or their calls for it will not be fruitful, because Corinth is probably the most powerful ally to the Spartans. So they're not going to do anything to the Spartans. Were not do anything to tick the Corinthians off. And so the Megarians are upset at this, and they know that Corinth is a powerful city-state, so they approach the Athenians and ally themselves with Athens. And so Athens goes to Megara, they build a new set of walls, and they send a military garrison in the land. At the same time, Athens is spreading its influence, again, internationally as well, so they actually send support for a rebellion in Egypt against the Persians, and they take 2/3 of Memphis. The loyalists or the Persians sympathizers are held up in what I guess would be their equivalent of the agora in the top portion of the city, and they're able to hold out, but the Athenians have taken over the majority of the city with the help of the rebels. So that's the Egyptian front. However, the Athenian fleet is attacked by Corinth and Epidaurian forces and is defeated. But the Athenians retaliate, and they're able to defeat the Peloponnesian navy. Afterwards, or during this point, Aegina, which is an island that is between the Peloponnese and Athens or Attica. So it's a very pivotal island in terms of bolstering a defense with Athens and the Peloponnese. Just like Megara is on land, this was kind of a sea equivalent of that. And these people cite war against the Athenians. But the Athenians are able to eventually force them to capitulate and win the region. But going more in depth into the Corinthian theater, Corinth is then attacked. Corinth attacks an adjacent area of Megara, which is another area, and they're hoping that because Athens is involved in all these conflicts that they might be spread too thin. So Athens sends an army of their young and old warriors to fight. It's an indecisive battle against the Corinthians. The Corinthians believe they won, and so do the Athenians. So the Corinthians set up their victory trophy and they leave, and then the Athenians set up a victory trophy, which calls the Corinthians to come back, and they fight again 12 days later. And the Athenian and Megarian army defeats the Corinthian army. So Sparta sends a force on an expedition to Doris, which is the mother city of the Spartans. And so they go to deal with that conflict, and it is in a region that is north of Attica. And so they go and they invade to do this, and they are victorious. But part of the issue is their whole army is in this area, and they are afraid to come back through land. They're afraid to come back on their boats because it would bring them too close to Athens, and there would be they were afraid that they could be taken over in a naval conflict because obviously Athens has the better navy, and they don't want to destroy their entire army in a naval conflict. So what they end up doing is they don't want to go by Megara because, again, the Athenians have just established themselves pretty forcibly in the area. So they decide to stay in Boeotia or Boeotia, which is a region just north of Attica. However, there are some Athenians who don't like the democracy. And again, this is another major conflict in this war between the Democrats and then the oligarchs, which the oligarchy is a system where there are two kings, and Sparta's kind of the head of that, and then Athens, again, is the democracy where any Athenian citizen may cast votes. However, the negative of both, even Thucydides can be a little critical of democracy. It's less so maybe democracy as a system or as an idea. He more critiques what it seems to do to people, which is create a mob rule. And he talks about a lot of the irrationality of people and how they're easily swayed and drawn to violence. And so there is this mob rule threat that democracy can present. However, oligarchy, can of course be very oppressive over its people. So there are some Athenians who don't like this, and they want to approach the Spartans to prevent this long wall that's being built to the port of Piraeus. And so Athens fears this, and so even though Sparta's unsure of how they're going to be able to go with avoiding conflict, being far from home, they see this as an opportunity to, maybe do what some of the Athenians are asking, to destroy this port. This is what Athens fears, at least, and they preemptively strike in a major battle against the Spartans. It's really tight. The Athenians lose. Maybe they would have won if the Thessalian cavalry had not betrayed them. But we don't know. What we do know is Sparta won the field. However, there were major casualties on both sides, and the Spartans don't push their advantage to take the port. So you can imagine that even though it's a victory on the field for the Spartans, the Athenians kind of have the victory of preventing Sparta from destroying the port. And so the Spartans leave Boeotia. And they, after this, the Athenians go and they actually take influence in Boeotia at the Battle of Onyphyta. They complete their walls, and then here starts a kind of rapid series of Athenian victories. So, again, what the Athenians are able to accomplish is pretty remarkable, and how quick it happens and how they utilize their navy in their ingenuity. So quickly, though, looking again at Egypt, they do have that victory there at Memphis, but this doesn't last long because the Persians send a new army and they are forced out. They're forced out of all of Egypt besides these major marshlands under a king called Amyraes. That sounds kind of funny to say, but anyway, Athenians send a relief force, but this is also defeated upon landing by the Persian army and the Phoenician fleet. So early victories in Egypt. Egypt's very wealthy, but because of the Persian emphasis on taking it back, the Athenians are not able to compete, or they don't compete as well. However, there still is that foothold in that marshland. The Athenians attack Thessaly, which you can probably imagine that they're fairly bitter for their betrayal. And Thessaly is a region north of Boeotia, and they're supporting an exiled ruler who has a claim at the throne. Of course, they would love for him to be an ally. They do have some success in the region, but they fail to be able to take the city, and so that's kind of a misadventure. However, they do have victory in torching the Spartan dockyards. They also defeat the Corinthian town of Chalce, or Calce or something. You're going to have to forgive my mispronunciations again. But they are also able to defeat the Cyanians under Pericles, and he wins a major battle. This is another important region, and Pericles is able to win this battle with 1,000 hoplites, and thereafter is set a 5-year treaty between Athens and Sparta, where the Athenians agree to not attack any of the Greek cities. So, and where Sion actually is, that Pericles is able to defeat is just north of Corinth in the Peloponnese. So there's kind of good and bad things that happen to Athens, and they're able to get these quick victories to establish themselves. But I think they do know that if they are in a knockdown, drag-out, certainly field battle with the Spartans, they will probably not win. So what this piece allows them to do is to establish themselves as a major power, and in the interim time, continue to develop their empire, which is exactly what they do. After this, they send 200 ships on an expedition to Cyprus, which is not a Greek city that at least Sparta is protecting. And they leave 60 to go support the Marsh king in Egypt. Already this fleet has victories against the Phocians and the Cyprilots. They establish a blockade on Citium, but they abandon that due to famine, and their leader Cimon is killed from the conditions. And after they had these victories, they join back with the Egyptian fleet, and they sail back to Attica. And then the next major event that happened, so the First Peloponnesian War has been established at this point. The Spartans and the Athenians, after that conflict they had in Boeotia, they are formally at war without the, after the 5 years peace. What happens next is what's called the Sacred War, and this begins when Spartan wins back possession of the temple at Delphi, which is in which is north of the Boeotian area, and it's the major religious city for the Greeks. The oracle at Delphi is very renowned, and whoever has dominance in the region, you can imagine, tends to have religious dominance or certainly religious influence over the whole of Greece. And so these Spartans take that over the Phocians. But after they leave, the Athenians take back the town and give it back to the Phocians. So it's kind of this in and out of the Spartans. They go, they do what they aim to do, and then they leave. And we can only assume that this is due to the fact that it's difficult to keep troops stationed militarily due to the high cost of such an expedition. But they're able to take it, but then again the Athenians take it back, which we saw that in Boeotia. However, the Boeotian exiles that were defeated by the Athenians recapture their cities and revolt against the Athenians, defeating them in battle. And this ends with the Boeotians reclaiming that region and ends the Athenian influence in those cities. After this, Euboea, which is an area where Athens has had some success, revolts, and Pericles leads an army to take back the region. At the same time, the Megarians revolt, the allies of formerly Sparta, and then they flipped to Athens, and now they've revolted against Athens. And they destroy the Athenian garrison. Let's see. And they bring troops from Corinth and elsewhere to help bolster their defenses against the Athenians. Pericles brings the army back, and during this time, the Spartans launch another invasion under Pleistoanax and ravage the land up to a city called Theria. They don't make it all the way to Athens, and they've had success, ravaging land and spoils, and so they actually head back to Sparta afterwards. Which, looking at a map, it looks like Thera is actually still in the Peloponnese. So, perhaps the city was an Athenian ally, or at least was a prominent piece. So after this, Pericles brings his army back after retaking Euboea. Like I just said, and then with this is the initiation of the 30-year treaty. So again, there's kind of this standstill of Athens having some success, but then Sparta still being the dominant military power, and so they initiate the 30 Years Treaty. And so essentially what this is initiated by, or what the points of the treaty are, is Athens is supposed to give back the cities that they conquered from the Peloponnesian League. Both sides can make an alliance, and they can make war against neutral cities, but they cannot impose war on their allies of the opposing sides. If there's an issue between the two sides, by arbitration will it be resolved, meaning that somebody who is appointed will say, no, Athens, you're wrong, or Sparta, you're wrong, or you're both wrong, and here's what you're going to do to peaceably resolve the situation. And that's what an arbiter is. It's not negotiation. It is this person or body that says you will do these things and there won't be war. So in a way, kind of guarantees that there won't be conflict for the next 30 years or so. They think the peace only ends up lasting for 14 years. There's the Samian War, which there's an island of the Samanos, and the Byzantine city revolts against the Athenians, and they attack on Miletus. And so what the Athenians end up doing is they send 60 ships with different assignments. Some are to engage, some are to gather reinforcements. 41 remain under Pericles. And it's actually, if you're looking at a map, Byzantium is way up by the Black Sea, but then Samos is really close to Miletus on kind of the central southern side of Ionia, which is modern-day Turkey. They engage the Samoan Navy, which consists of 70 ships coming back from Miletus, and they defeat them in a decisive battle. The Athenians then land on Samos and establish a fort and a blockade. The Samians launch a surprise attack on the blockade and are able to hold it off for 14 days. But there's another Athenian navy coming in under the leadership of Thucydides and the author, and they come in and are able to defeat the Samoans. And so both the Byzantines and the Samoans capitulate and destroy their walls against the Athenian influence. So this is the first Peloponnesian War, and this starts to set up the stage for what seems to come, and then we'll go more in depth into the more immediate events of the Peloponnesian War itself formally, that Thucydides goes into such great detail about. Here, this is still the build-up. This isn't the formal war that we think of, but again, this is the first war. This is how Athens and Sparta have kind of split Greece in two, where Sparta has, of course, the strong land influence, but then Athens has this amazing empire of sea and all these islands that are contributing to them. And during this time, the golden age of Athens, they're able to build the Parthenon under Pericles. They're able to, all the amazing things that the Athenians are known for really happen in this time, or are established in this time. But I think it's also important when we look at these events not to judge too harshly. I mean, this is a different time with different peoples, and it's really easy to be able to point the finger and say that the Athenians were wrong in this instance, or the Spartans were wrong in this instance. The truth of it is there's not a set good guy versus a set bad guy. Both the Spartans and the Athenians do things that are both good and bad, though none of it is quite unique, at least in how they handle themselves. For example, in some of the conflicts, some of the dialogues that Thucydides goes into, one of the things that the Athenians say in a council is that it seems that men are more angered by injustice than they are by enforcement. And I think that's an important part, because in any city-state in the Athenian position would act at least very similar to how the Athenians acted and how they set up their empire. Later in the book, there's a speech where they talk of how it's only natural for a dominant power to establish themselves as such. And certainly in the way history has played out, that's what people have done. They see that they have an advantage and they press it. In some areas, the Athenians were cruel, but in some areas they were reasonable, even if they did strip away what we would define as inalienable rights from those peoples. Though, it causes us to really appreciate the freedoms that we have and the assumptions that we have. But again, I felt like it was a really good observation by the Athenians where, what they were talking about was some of the difficulty of actually having an alliance and having democratic governments. They see themselves as equals, at least their allies do, or the people they're trying to subdue. And so they get really upset when they feel like there's an injustice against them. If the Athenians were to go in and just establish and enforce themselves and impose themselves upon them, while they wouldn't like that either, I guess it's part of human nature to just kind of get used to that and not, the door is not open to really any political flexibility. So just to keep that in mind as we go through the rest, and certainly go through the rest of the more immediate events that set up the Second Peloponnesian War. So this will be part 1 of book 1, and next we'll be looking at part 2 of book 1, again, which is the more immediate effects with Corcyra and Pontida, and how those two events really shaped the onset of the Peloponnesian War. But again, really those are, as Thucydides would argue, they are essentially just pretenses for the real cause, which again is fear. So, hope you enjoy this. Hopefully I will continue to get better at pronunciations and also at explaining the certain events that happen in the onset of such a crucial war for Greek history, but also world history.